wonky to begin with. Thank you for coming to my virtual book launch. I am talking through my phone, which is on a tripod right now, so I don't even have the usual Facebook Live interaction of knowing what you're posting. Erin is going to be keeping track of any questions, comments you have, and I'll address those a couple of times during this launch. I reference my anxiety disorder in the title of my book. I'm experiencing it right now, so we might get off to a bit of a rough start. I think the vision here is that I'm nervous and anxious off the top, so I'm going to be weird because of that. And then we're going to relax into a bit of a middle where everything is okay, and then I'm just going to get comfortable, and then it's going to be weird because I'm going to be me. So that's, I think, what's going to go on here. I'm going to prepare you for that, / prepare myself for that. Anyway, hi, I'm Sarah Kurchak, the author of I Overcame My Autism and All I Got Was This Lousy Anxiety Disorder, which is officially a memoir according to the cover. I think it's a collection of essays, but whatever, it's a book. And it came out 2 days ago in a world that doesn't really exist right now, and it all feels very surreal to me. But I'm here in my bedroom with my partner in life and crime. Also, my assistant Arcadia is here. Who knows, she might crash the party later. And I'm going to do a couple of readings from the book and from other stuff I reference in the book. Hopefully answer some questions if you have any. And Erin's going to have a few questions to jump into. So that's what we're going to try here. I would like to thank the Toronto International Festival of Authors, who were going to support the real meat space party I was going to have today, and hopefully we'll have someday in the future. They're also supporting this, and I'm very grateful for that. I want to thank Anna Comfort O'Keefe for the support, for being a great publisher, and for apparently liking whatever weirdness happens beyond the book too. I really appreciate that support. Karina and Kareen for all of your support as well, and Erin for putting up with me through all of this, and also, being my pinch hitter in apartment media person who's going to help me through this, and my homie forever and always. So I'm going to, so the book is available through online vendors and your local bookstore. Please consider, if you have a favorite bookstore that's still running, call and email them to see what's going on there. They might be able to deliver it to you. There's also, if you're not sure where to go, a great Google Maps resource where someone is keeping track of all the independent bookstores that are currently open in Canada and working. I'll post that into Facebook later and on Twitter as many times as you'll tolerate me before you mute me, or probably after you mute me as well. Please do that. It's out in Canada right now. It will be out in the rest of the world on September 22nd, which for the rest of you who are supporting me but still have to wait months, and this feels super weird and early, thanks so much for putting up with me. I'll try to be tolerable if there's another wave of this on September 22nd, presuming we're all here, so thank you. And all right. So to start off with, I'm going to read the introduction of my book because I think it kind of describes what the vision of the book is. Also, it amuses me. But I haven't been the most on point in my interviews discussing and promoting the book so far in terms of my actual sort of thesis statement on what it is and what I wanted it to be. So I wanted to take a chance to just sort of establish that scene and do a much better version of it than I have been able to say in my current executive dysfunction apocalypse brain phase. So, this is the introduction. In 2017, I wrote an essay. This probably shouldn't be remarkable, certainly not worthy of its own sentence at the beginning of an introduction. I wrote an essay in 2017. Big deal. I wrote 15 in the following 2 years, which you're now holding in your hands, but you're not, because I am. It's what I'm supposed to do, being a writer and all. But every essay feels like a perverse miracle that leaches out of me, fully formed like those terrifying snowsuit-clad rage babies sprung from Nora Corvith in David Cronenberg's 1979 body horror classic, The Brood. I come away from each one having no idea how I managed to accomplish it. I go into the next one having gained absolutely no knowledge or confidence from the experience. This particular essay was worse. On the surface, it was, like most things I was writing at the time, about autism. For me, though, it was about failure and letting go. My life and career were at an impasse. I was lucky to have enough paying work to barely sustain me, and grateful that some of it appeared to be meaningful to my fellow autistic people. But I was becoming exponentially more frustrated with the limitations of writing about autism for a largely non-autistic audience, in a medium almost entirely by and for non-autistic people, with each passing assignment. Autistic people were learning more about autism from our own lives and each other, but our outside audience wasn't developing at the same rate. I was faring all right with the basic Autism 101 material, how we feel about the anti-vaccine movement, the state of media representation, how we feel about the anti-vaccine movement, why we don't like eye contact, how some awareness campaigns can miss the mark, and how we feel about the anti-vaccine movement. Efforts to express something deeper, more nuanced, or simply more interesting than that, in words or in life, were generally met with well-meaning but patronizing rejection. This essay was going to be my way of coming to terms with my professional and personal frustrations as best I could. A last gasp of effort in the face of inevitable defeat, like Robert Vaughn's character summoning his final shred of courage before his scenery-chewing death in The Magnificent Seven, or legendary wrestler Kazuchika Okada declaring that a man stands like this, with his hand on a wall, when things are easy in his life before collapsing into said wall during a backstage interview for the G1 Climax 28. A way to say goodbye to the hopes I'd had from my words and their impact before resigning myself to a lifetime of vaccine op-eds and awkward misunderstandings. After much crying, pouting, and prostrating, this dying light rage baby was published in Hazlitt in the middle of Autism Awareness Month, 2018. And then we actually published the whole essay, Real Autism, which starts by me talking about the autistic sex comedy I so desperately want to write, and going through, people telling me my writing is real, wondering what the hell they mean by that. It's a very serious essay. People who don't actually like my writing like it, so maybe check that out in the book or online at hazlitt.com. So, once we finish that, we get back to the introduction. What I saw as a literary obituary, one agent saw as a call to answer. After reading the essay, she reached out and asked me what kind of book I'd want to write if I were given the opportunity. I pled my case for the aforementioned autistic teen sex comedy. Then I tried to induce the novella about Plato, Socrates, professional wrestling, and homoerotic fan fiction I'd written in my early 20s into the conversation. To paraphrase Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots to sell your repurposed adolescent ancient Greek philosopher / to a bona fide literary agent that you don't take. When she deftly shepherded the conversation towards nonfiction, I mentioned a third dream project. I overcame my autism, and all I got was this lousy anxiety disorder. Not a straightforward memoir. No one who has spent a statistically significant portion of their life alone in their room should be allowed to inflict one of those on the world. But a loosely connected series of personal essays that tackled important topics to autistic people and my personal experiences with them. The content was more of an abstract concept at that point, but I was very excited about the title. I signed with her and began working on a book proposal immediately. It was one of those overnight successes almost 2 decades in the making. Although I was riding a momentary high on account of the whole fairy god agent situation, I still wanted to tell my story as a cautionary tale. It's how I genuinely view my life, but this opportunity also gave me a chance to be the change in terms of autism narratives I wanted to see in the world. Most of the stories you hear about autistic people in media and art are either miserable tragedies or inspirational triumphs, while most of our real lives exist somewhere in between. With my book, I could finally introduce some much-needed emoji shrug into the conversation. There's actually an emoji shrug. It's beautiful. Here are some of the things that accidentally ruined my life. Here are some of the things that surprisingly saved it. And here I am, leading a neutral autistic life that requires little pity, but probably shouldn't be the object of aspiration either. When it came to time to figure out how I was going to loosely thread those suckers together, the only thing that made sense to me was as a wry anti-instruction guide. Much to my horror, and a little to my perverse amusement, I'd started noticing some of the more plaintive essays that I'd written about various missteps I'd made in my life being shared in autism parenting groups like they were useful templates for raising happy, healthy autistic kids. In one case, a story about how I'd use TV shows to help me figure out social skills in the absence of any better options was being passed around as something that might be worth a try. As if anyone should take those kind of cues from a nerd who writes about gaining insights into workplace dynamics from news radio for the internet. If people felt any inclination to treat my major falls and minor lifts like a how-to manual, I figured I could at least try to warn them about how all the ill-advised and socially... Let me read that again. I figured out how I could at least try to warn them about how ill-advised and occasionally impossible that pursuit is. So here you have my 15 uneasy steps to an autistic success story. You're welcome to call this real. I hope you do. Just please don't try this at home. Thanks. Alright, so we're going to bring Erin in for a quick Q&A kind of conversation, but... Okay, Erin's doing 3 questions, which he only remembered he was supposed to do a little bit before this started, so this should be interesting. Oh.
Hello, everybody. We have multiple Q&A sessions, so that's why we're only going to do 3 to start with. So, first question. When was the last time you actually went outside?
It was March 10th. It's when I got my hair done and went blonde again. Yeah.
And why has it been so long since you've gone outside?
Well, I mean, one is hypochondria, but it's also just, I basically didn't want to risk getting COVID-19 before this happened. I figure there's always a risk if I go out after that, and I can't stop living my life entirely. But I basically didn't want to be holed up in bed for my one little moment of celebration and wanted to pull this off without any undue risk.
Now, I think you've mentioned this a couple times online, and I lived and witnessed the experience. So I'm well aware of how difficult it was to actually write. What percentage of this book do you think was actually written in stairwells, hallways, abandoned swampy pool areas, and other unusual urban decay in an old dying apartment building locations?
Okay, fair enough. So we had to move a couple of months ago because the building we lived in, which was our home for about 8 years, and me being autistic, I hate change. That was going to be my home for as long as I could afford it, is being torn down to make way for condos because Toronto. And so our building had kind of turned into a little bit of a low-rise J.G. Ballard high-rise situation, which made it perversely interesting to live in, and also, I guess, kind of fascinating to write in. Erin works from home part-time in the normal world, which meant that I didn't really have a room of one's own to write an entire manuscript in about 6 to 8 weeks, which is how fast I had to write the initial manuscript for this book. Which meant that, in terms of me writing this deeply personal material for long periods of time a day to make sure it was done, and going through all of that, I was also an autistic person living in a 1-bedroom apartment with a human and a cat who were often sort of overwhelming my already fraught sensory issues, which meant that I was escaping to just various decrepit holes of our dying apartment building. And so yeah, probably I would say about 30% was written hiding in stairwells. We had this walkway in our building that was probably really pretty at one time before it was neglected, that I just hung out in with some weird plants that people had thrown out and wrote there. And I actually didn't write anything in our gross pool, but I wish I had.
Okay, and one more before I sign off for this section, and this one is taken from some of the comments. And I promised not to go too deep into wrestling related discourse, but one thing that I know you enjoy deeply, specifically about Japanese wrestling, and to be fair, I appreciate too, is that their use of symbolism in their clothing, where there are incredibly small details sewn into their shorts, into their outfits, into their robes. People have noticed that you're wearing specific tights tonight. They may not get the entirety of the vision of your tights, but can you tell the camera about your tights? Maybe stand up for a half second to flash it just a little bit better.
Does this work? Yeah, I didn't actually plan for them to go together with this shirt. But Anna, my publisher, said don't wear jeans, and I was wearing jeans when she said that, so I was like, oh, screw it, I'm gonna put my Tragically Hip leggings on. So this is an actual Tragically Hip merch item from when Gord Downie was still alive. I think it was for like the 20th or 25th anniversary of Fully Completely. 25th maybe? Oh god. Fully Completely is one of the first CDs I ever owned. I think it came out when I was about 10, and kind of transformed my life because it was like this fun rock music, and there were like boobs on the album cover, which I thought was really funny and cool. There's like a boob on my knee right now. But also was sort of an entrance into a different world for me, because I'm like one of those poetry nerds who got really into Gord Downie's lyrics and references. Fully Completely is actually the first time I was ever introduced to Milan Kundera, who's quoted in it, and most obviously, of course, Courage of Hugh McLennan, which is called, I think, Courage for Hugh McLennan is the full title. I actually bought The Watch That Ends the Night to read because it was referenced in Fully Completely, and became a huge Hugh McLennan nerd. He's probably my favorite, like, dead can-lit guy other than Robertson Davies, because Fifth Business is the best. And so, yeah, I think it hits a lot of notes for me. It's Canadian music, which has been a major factor in my life. It's weird, nerdy literature, which has been a big deal for me. And there's boobs on it, which is now an ongoing theme of my outfit. So it's the perfect Kurchak experience for this.
I think you've earned your first champagne break.
All right.
And I'm going to take off.
Bye, Aaron. Thank you. What? Oh, we gotta bring Bluebell and Narrow back. So yeah, this apartment is also filled with stuffed animals in a way that I really hope isn't creepy. Maybe it is, but you know, I'm a sad autistic kid who was bullied a lot, and for a lot of years, stuffed animals were my only friends, and I always want to honor that. Also, if you're into New Japan, you can't not own stuffed animals from that fandom now. So, in the introduction, I mentioned a couple of failed or maybe just non-published yet works that I desperately try to sneak into the world, and so I thought, why not try again? There's no one here to stop me. I have no actual instant feedback from any of you that this is a bad idea, or I'm not even aware if you're logging off. So, this actually recreates what I'm like socially, because I wouldn't be able to read if you were bored if I was actually talking to you in person anyway. So this, I guess, is also the Kurchak experience. The first piece I'm going to read is from Slash, which is a novella about Plato and Socrates, pro wrestling, and Slash fanfiction, which I was convinced was like an absolute work of genius when I was 20 through 23. This is actually the novella I workshopped in the Humber School for Writers, which is a highly respected program in this country that I wrote this for. I tried to submit it to an agent once who actually thought I was trying to submit actual Slash fan fiction, and it was really awkward for me to try to explain that no, I was, other than the actual Plato and Socrates part in this book, which is fan fiction, I wrote about Plato and being in love with Socrates when I was 17. So there's another reason why I had no friends growing up. So this is from the second half of the book where I'm sort of parroting like the jock in school being in the closet. So this is the smartest girl in school has become associated with this poor guy who's in love with her but is getting boners watching wrestling with his best friend, who his best friend is in love with him. Sydney, the girl, has befriended the best friend, and just previously to this, she had started watching wrestling, isn't really admitting it. She elbow dropped him because she was mad at him, and then she ran away. So this is where we pick up in the beautiful slash novella. Although Sydney was curious about the website, it's a slash fanfiction website, this is way before AO3 was a thing, wallowing in self-loathing was a very demanding task, and she simply didn't have the time for any diversions. Instead, she curled up in the fetal position and cursed the ruined shambles of her life. Whatever question, whatever hope there'd been that it was only a mild curiosity, a silly phase, or youthful experimentation had been shattered in that one moment in the empty classroom. She was one. Sydney damned the fateful event as melodramatically as she possibly could, wishing she could rip off the offending elbow and offer it to some sort of atonement to the gods. And if she wasn't forgiven, she wanted to be struck dead then and there. She didn't want to live to see the look of horror and disappointment on Ethan and Amanda's faces. Instead of death, she got Adam. In a way, it was an appropriate substitution, as both represented her doom. For a young woman praying for a solemn and silent reaper, however, the excitable boy pounding on her door was a grave disappointment. "Can I come in, Sid?" he asked, politely enough. "Or are you going to Luthez press me if I set foot in your room?" Sydney begrudgingly opened the door for him. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, desperately wishing it was the truth. "Sid, I was there. You can't deny what happened." He was right. Her body was already buckling under the weight of the lie she was trying to live. But she could barely admit it to herself, let alone another person. She just wasn't ready yet. "I can't, Adam. Not now. I can't deal with this. Promise me you won't tell anyone." "I promise, Sid. I wouldn't expose you, but I would like to take you out tonight. There's something I'd like to show you." It sounded like a trap, but there was something so genuine in his gentle smile. "You want to take me out?" she asked, trying to sound wary, even though a part of her was already willing to follow him anywhere. "As friends," he offered. As friends. She couldn't refuse those two words. They were all she had now. He was all she had. So she made the choice to trust him, guilelessly following him to a sports bar called The Pillar, which is a nod to Gore Vidal's book where the two boys wrestle and then have sex. Her hand may have shaken as she placed it on the door, but she never lost her resolve. She thrust the door open and only paused long enough to let her friend through. Then Sydney, the smartest girl in school, took one last breath and let him lead her into the bowels of the beast. The interior was every bit as tacky as she'd imagined it. It assaulted her aesthetic sensibilities with its neon beer lights and garish memorabilia, and yet something about it excited her. It was so unlike the hardwood and bourgeois leather of Amanda and Ethan's world. In fact, it was the sort of place they'd never be caught dead in. Maybe, just maybe, a place where she could be herself. And that was when she saw it. Mounted on the far wall of the bar was the most majestic big-screen TV she'd ever seen. It was the monolith, and she was the ape ready to learn from its wisdom. It was playing wrestling. "Can I get you a drink?" Adam asked, distracting her from her reverie. "I could use a few," she replied, her mind already racing with the possibilities. Well, he smiled. "What do you want to start with?" Not a Riesling, that was for damn sure. She wanted something cheaper, something domestic, something Ethan and Amanda wouldn't sip, let alone chug. She wanted beer. "Okay, beer," he said. "In a can." Adam returned with a bottle, but she wouldn't let that dampen her spirits. "So, Sid," he prodded ever so lightly, "about that elbow." Sid responded with a hearty gulp, and then a few more gulps. Adam was forced to return to the bar before he could say anything more on the subject. As he walked away, a cheer erupted from the small crowd. Agathon, their hero, had appeared on screen. Caught up in the excitement of the moment, Sydney brushed aside her inhibitions and wandered into the midst of tables facing the TV. Finding a free one, she sat down and officially joined the others. "Nice place, eh?" Adam took the seat next to her and slid 2 bottles in her direction. "That should keep you busy for a while." Sydney wasn't entirely convinced, but she smiled and thanked him nonetheless. "So if you don't want to talk about the other thing yet, have you looked at the website?" I've got a lot on my plate right now, she snapped. I can't just drop everything and do what Wayne wants me to. I looked at it, he admitted a little sheepishly. Sydney found herself getting jealous again. Of course you did. What that fool has over you, I'll never know. Come on, Sid. Adam picked at the label on his own bottle. You're a smart girl. It's not that hard to figure out. They were interrupted by a cacophonous clash of cheers and boos. Arrow was getting into the ring. That's the sound of a heel turn in progress, Adam said, pointing to the screen. He was speaking that weird language again, the one that had made her feel ill and sent her bolting from the classroom, the one she believed she never needed to learn because it would make her one of them. Heel turn, she asked. Era and Adam both grinned. It's when a wrestler turns into a bad guy, the latter explained as the former demonstrated it. Sydney found this very curious. So does that mean bad guys are called heels? Yes, and good guys are baby faces. Sydney collapsed into giggles. So you use these silly words to dissect plot and character? Our words may seem strange to you, but at least we're still interested in things like plot and character. It's really not so different from your English class. For the first time in her life, Sydney was left speechless. Not even the simplest dismissive non sequitur would spew from her impotent tongue. He was right. There was really no difference between the people in the bar and the people in the classroom. They were all human beings, all deserving of love and respect and the right to live their life the way they wanted, regardless of their preferences in sports and entertainment. I didn't expect there to be women here, she said. Wrestling fans come in all shapes and sizes, Adam replied. I guess I'd always assumed that wrestling fans were men with beer guts who sat in front of the TV in their underwear and thought it was all real. He shrugged it off. That's just a stereotype. I mean, I'm sure those people exist in the world, and that's okay, but not everyone who watches wrestling is like that. Once again, he was right. That was just a stereotype, and wrestling fans really did come in all shapes and sizes. Even the form of the smartest girl in school. Adam, she started shyly, I have something to tell you. This is hard for me. I've been struggling with this for a long time, but I feel I can no longer deny my feelings or my true nature. I've finally realized that it doesn't change the kind of person I am and that I'm still a good, smart person, and I've learned to accept myself for who I am. Adam? I'm a wrestling fan. He looked at her quizzically for a moment and then responded casually, I'm gay. Oh. Just promise you won't tell anyone. It was really hard for me to come out to you. I'm not ready for the world to know just yet. I won't tell a soul, he assured her. Okay, so that's from Slash. Now we're going to go on to content warning, ableist language. I have not come up with a new title for this project yet. This is the actual title. I named it when I was one with my friend Natalie, and this is what we called ourselves. I will come up with a better one if I ever have a chance to finish writing this. It was called Psycho Virgins on the Prowl. I was watching a lot of B movies, and it just seemed like a funny title. So, this is how it starts. On a scale of 1 to Carrie, prom was a disappointing 7.4. Talia, my best and close to only friend in the world, agreed to be my platonic date for the night. She wore a ball gown, a bolero, and a tasteful number of sparkles and looked like something out of a popular teen drama. I wore thick plastic glasses and combat boots and looked like myself. We both sported semi-ironic corsages that we'd purchased for each other, and the strained smiles of people who were enjoying themselves but possibly expected a bit more. We ate chicken and drank non-alcoholic champagne out of engraved flutes, and hoped that this really wasn't, as the inscription on them insisted, the time of our lives. The popular people gave each other awards in celebration of their hair and future prospects. No one executed any elaborate plots that culminated in my messy humiliation. I did experience some minimal embarrassment and garden variety awkwardness over the course of the evening, but that is to be expected when I go outside and or talk to people. Then we danced to music that I occasionally tolerated. I would go so far as to say that I had fun. I should have been happy, or at least relieved. I'd been anticipating a literal or figurative prom night bloodbath since I first saw Carrie as an impressionable 12-year-old. It just seemed like the inevitable conclusion to all of my school years of social failure and bullying. When I made it through the dinner, awards, and dancing with my hair, dress, and soul unsullied by viscera and or ritual debasement, though, I didn't feel like I'd been spared. I felt like I'd been forgotten. On our walk from the shiny new Falls View Hotel, where we'd had the official event, to the Batesy and old school Niagara Falls motel that was hosting the somewhat less sanctioned after party, I tried to express my perverse disappointment to my date. Talia, who spent our adolescence listening to and understanding my foibles, or at least getting a better handle on them than anyone else, was sympathetic but pragmatic. You've been on home study for 2 years, she pointed out. Perhaps everyone forgot and moved on. Kids these days and their short attention spans. But I left a terrible impression, didn't I countered. I was weird and off-putting. I ran funny. I didn't know how to whisper. I wouldn't stop talking about the Titanic. I had a seizure in sex ed. And I was on home study because I had a giant, very public meltdown over a pop quiz. You don't just forget about stuff like that. Perhaps not. You don't go out of your way to dump blood on it either, she said, in what I think was supposed to be a conciliatory tone. I was not conciliated. I spent a third of my life trying to figure out how to move objects and set fires with my mind for this. I don't actually know if you're joking or not, but I think I support you either way. Mostly joking, I admitted, but I did kind of hope that I had a latent special skill that could be awakened through public trauma. Talia shrugged. I think you're confusing savantism and telekinesis again, and anyway, you're not that kind of autistic. Alright, I'm gonna have another glass of champagne. And Erin is going to come back.
All right. So, 3 more questions.
Okay.
Maybe 4. These are taken from the comments, but I didn't realize until partway through that I should be transcribing the whole question and who asked the question. So, the first 2 people, I apologize.
Okay.
You're getting
Mystery
your
people.
questions paraphrased and maybe incorrectly stated, and you don't get credit. But we'll look through in the conversation afterwards and like your comments. So the first one, again, paraphrasing, might be incorrect.
Mm-hmm.
Is there going to be any Niagara Falls related content in your current presentation of this event?
There just wasn't there? I kind of snuck it in there, but the prom actually happened in Niagara Falls, both in the book and the real life prom that inspired it. And also, there is this, which is a piece of ephemera depicting one of the last uses of the ice bridge in Niagara Falls, which was a present from Erin. Which is nice because I love it, and also because it means you supported something weird I love.
So next is, this is one that I actually managed to transcribe. What is your experience / take on the body of language used to describe autism as an identity label? That's from Nathan. So.
Okay, what is my experience take on the body of language used as a, Nathan, I wish I knew who you were because I wish I knew whether this was in good faith or not. I mean, it probably is because most people don't have experience with the autism dark web and trying to turn everything well-meaning people say about autism as, like, not a shit thing into some sort of way to deny all of the inherent, like, issues all of us face, regardless of so-called, like, functioning label or, you know, needs, as I prefer to say it. There a lot of pushback to the autism as identity movement seems to come from some incredible fear that it's either going to be co-opted by people who don't suffer enough to deserve it, which is fucking bullshit, or it comes out of a fear that people are going to, like, embrace a part of themselves, which we're never going to be rid of. And even if it were, like, the worst thing that could happen to a person, which I genuinely don't believe for any of us, regardless of needs, like, why would you not allow someone to interact with an inherent part of themselves, which will always be part of themselves, which has an influence on every aspect of their life, whether they want it to or not? Why would you want them to always stay separate from that and, like, not embrace it? Because I don't think that, like, being like, hey, I'm autistic and I'm okay with being autistic is saying I never need to work on anything. It's not saying I don't suffer. It's, like, not saying, oh, I'm better, I'm highly evolved. It's really not any of those things. It's just, like, moving on with your fucking life beyond, like, trying to cut a piece of you out, either for your own self-concept or for how you deal with other people and make them think about you. So, I don't know if I've answered anything there, but, like, if people want to celebrate autism, just fucking let them.
I'm going to take it down a notch after that one. This one's from Haley, again, paraphrased.
Hi, Haley.
Haley noticed that you were reading from handwritten notes and wanted to know if that was part of your process, and if so, why?
It's actually not. So here's not a fun story, but it's my story. So I decided today that I wanted to read passages from my failed manuscripts. And we don't have a printer. So I had no way of, like, getting them off my laptop. I didn't feel like reading on my laptop. We're recording this on my phone, so I didn't have access to any of the means of just, like, reading it digitally. And so I got it into my, like, autistic head that, oh, I'll write it down. It won't be that hard. And I do, like, tend to write down notes because paper feels less permanent to me. It's the only way I can, like, write and allow myself to make mistakes. But it turns out that I don't usually write about 2,000 words handwritten a day, and now my hand is cramping, and I'm really going to regret this tomorrow. I am absolutely feeling my age in my right hand right now.
All right, so I think champagne break and on to the next reading.
Actually, sparkling rosé from Trieste. It's not from the Champagne region of France. If you are, like, a Niagara person, most of the wineries are delivering, and they're using couriers right now. Most of them are offering free delivery in Ontario, at least, if not the rest of the country. And they're not using Canada Post, so, like, you don't have to truck down to the post office and show ID to get your packages. It will actually come to your door. So I would ask you to please consider that, especially some of the smaller places, like, say, Small Talk Winery that has Shiny Apple Cider, the best cider in the country. I would really like them to still exist after all of this is done. And I have already given them a bunch of my money, and I'm a struggling freelancer, so if any of you could buy that too, that'd be really amazing. They have, like, a whiskey barrel aged cider that's incredible. So, now that I've rambled and sold something that's not my book in my book process, I'm going to read another essay from the book. Most of this, other than my autism identity rant in there, has been pretty light so far, which I don't want to give you the impression that the whole book is like that. There is a lot of serious stuff. I just also, like, didn't feel like crying during this, so I'm gonna sort of avoid some of the more serious essays. So please don't think this is all flighty, but I'm going to read the one about pillow fighting now. So this is step 7. It's called Find a Healthy Outlet for Your Identity Crisis, like professional pillow fighting. At 2 points in my life, I very deliberately decided to change my personality for a specific purpose. When I wanted to be liked, or at least left alone, I patterned myself after anyone and everyone who seemed remotely lovable. When I wanted to be hated, I turned to an equally obvious template: myself. I tried the first one for the same reason that I did most things between the ages of 9 and 14. I was bullied, terrified, desperate to do anything to alleviate that onslaught, and not exactly filled with any healthier or more mature ideas because I was spending my formative years being bullied and terrified. I did the second one for the same reason that I've made a disconcerting number of impetuous choices over the course of my ostensibly immature adult life, because I fell in love with professional wrestling. I started following wrestling early in my relationship with Aaron. I was a raging snob who had grown up on art house films and classic literature and was viciously baffled to discover that this man that I adored, who was smart and otherwise seemed to have good taste, could be so taken with it. So I watched some programming from what was then known as the WWF out of perverse curiosity. What could he see in this bread and circus that I had always dismissed as lowest common denominator trash? Within a week, I sure got it. Once I opened my mind to it, wrestling immediately appealed to me as someone who loves narrative in any medium. It was potent and vital, witty and melodramatic, with a powerful, almost fourth wall and boundary-breaking connection to its audience that no other contemporary art form was even attempting. I didn't just love it as a fan, I was completely enraptured with it as a baby writer who wanted to figure out how to recreate that magic with her own storytelling. And it continues to be a wonderful and bizarre influence on me. One of the essays in this book was inspired by a brilliantly bonkers narrative structure for a match from a Japanese promotion called DDT Pro Wrestling, the title of which was, roughly translated, Captain's Fall, Anal Explosion, Time Difference, Web News Posting, Tag Deathmatch. As my casual interest grew into an autistically obsessive deep dive into the world of pro wrestling, I started to daydream about what kind of wrestler I'd be. There was no question that I wanted to be a heel. As a fan, I simply thought the bad guys were more interesting than their often one-dimensional do-gooder babyface counterparts. As a writer, I was thoroughly intrigued by the complex blend of physical and verbal storytelling that went into crafting the antagonistic characters and their stories, and I wanted to try it for myself. As a former bullied kid, I found the idea of being hated on purpose kind of refreshing and maybe even liberating. How nice it would be to make my off-putting nature useful for once. As for gimmick, I went with the most villainous thing I could think of. A weird, overcompensating smart girl with a chip on her shoulder. I called this monster Cerebellum, because how could any nerd named Sarah resist the pun? In my spare time, I dream up snide and condescending promos for her, and delivered a few of them when I was home alone. A few years into my fixation, a fellow chart writer and host of a local wrestling and MMA radio show told me that he was working for a new sports entertainment promotion called the Pillow Fight League. The fights themselves would be real. The outcomes wouldn't be predetermined, and any move from MMA, boxing, or amateur wrestling would be legal as long as it employed a pillow at the point of contact. The characters, storylines, and overall spectacle would absolutely be taking their cues from pro wrestling, though. They were looking for fighters, and he thought that I'd be perfect for it. Cerebellum, the scholar of pillow fighting, became a reality. Autistic people love pro wrestling. This is a completely unscientific observation made by an admittedly biased observer. But in my experience as an autistic wrestling fan who has spent a lot of time interacting with other autistic people and comparing notes about our lives, I've noticed that a disproportionate number of us seem to have an intense interest in this universe. I have 3 theories about this phenomenon. Part of me has wondered if the disparity between autistic people and non-autistic people in this regard is less a matter of taste than a matter of openness. Wrestling is a brilliant art form filled with limitless potential for sweeping operatic plots and stunningly intimate character studies. Sure, it can also be overwrought, self-indulgent, offensive, aimlessly provocative, or just plain shit, but that potential exists in all media. Some of my favorite art films are aimlessly provocative shit. The percentage of non-autistic people who would be willing to admit their interest to the world, or to themselves, would probably be similar to the percentage of autistic people if wrestling wasn't derided as being lowbrow and low class. The stigma that still surrounds the medium is far less of a concern for autistics. We're either unable to pick up on the subtle social cues that tell us that loving wrestling is improper or uncool, or simply don't care because we're already such misunderstood misfits in so many other aspects of our lives. Or maybe it's just that, for those of us who use entertainment to help us try to understand and interact with the non-autistic world around us, wrestling's broad themes and theatrically exaggerated expressions offer accessible, if not entirely healthy, insights into everything from betrayal and social machinations to teamwork, friendship, and overcoming challenges. I've recently come up with a 3rd theory, though. While many still dismiss wrestling because it's fake, it might be wrestling's blurred and ever-shifting line between fiction and reality, particularly when it comes to the relationship between wrestlers and their characters, that appeals to us most of all. Some wrestlers play entirely fictional supernatural beings. Others inhabit barely exaggerated versions of themselves. How much of their own life creeps into the performance is unique to each individual, and not always obvious to others. For those of us who mask, a fairly common autistic behavior that involves consciously and subconsciously hiding our noticeable autistic traits in an effort to appear more socially acceptable, what could be more relatable? What could be more real than this constant navigation between person and persona? I wasn't thinking about any of this when I joined the PFL. I didn't know for certain that I was autistic yet, much less what that actually entailed. I strongly suspected it was the case, though. When a friend had suggested that I look up the symptoms for Asperger syndrome and high-functioning autism in my early 20s, I checked almost all of the boxes. But I didn't really know what to do with that information because there were no meaningful options for testing or treatments for adults in Ontario who couldn't afford private services. So I just tucked that suspicion into the back of my mind and gave myself a little credit for fixing any and all problems I might have had with social skills, self-regulation, etc. And proceeded to craft an elaborate alter ego for my professional fighting career that would finally bury any lingering pain and resentment I still had from the bad years. as any normal person would. I thought cerebellum was going to be an exorcism of sorts, a way to make use of and finally make peace with my less than idyllic self during my less than idyllic formative years. Someone I could inhabit for fun because her failings were no longer my own. I was kind of tolerable now. I could sort of make friends. I was well on my way to being a legitimate jock. I wasn't that weird little charmless nerd anymore. I would just play her on the martial arts mats and on the mic. "You're not a heel," Aaron insisted when I first started sharing my plans for my character with him. "No one's gonna boo you. You're so much smaller than the other women. No matter how much shit you talk, you'll still be the underdog." He was right about the size difference. If the PFL had weight classes, I would have been at least 2 below all but one of my fellow fighters. Hi, Ivy. My height and reach also put me at a disadvantage. The poor love-struck fool was sorely misguided about the rest, though. "You didn't know me when I was younger, I replied, which was fair. "You have no idea," which was not. "I like you and therefore have cause to believe that others might too," being a very valid argument. I approached cerebellum's realization with a conviction and self-assurance absent in almost every other area of my life. My social interactions were uniformly riddled with self-doubt and anxiety, and I second-guessed my every breath for weeks afterwards. I was so insecure about my work as a young writer that my process had become almost comically self-flagellating, even by typical self-loathing writer standards. But I knew I could obliterate any potential goodwill that the audience might feel compelled to extend to me within 30 seconds of opening my mouth. I'd been putting people off inadvertently for my whole life. I flattened my vocal range back into a few nasal notes. I dropped the exaggerated smiles and raised eyebrows that I'd been affecting in an effort to portray kindness and interest after years of being told that people couldn't read my face. I stopped trying to hide that strange, flimsy cockiness that brutally unpopular kids sometimes have. The one we develop to try to convince ourselves and everyone else that people only hate us because we're so brilliant and they're just jealous. I pulled my hair into a prissy bun and my mouth into a tight smirk. I wore my own glasses. With a stiff posture and even stiffer, overly formal speech, I demanded quiet and declared my love of rules. I earned my first booze within 2 lines of my first promo at our first live event. In retrospect, I must have been overwhelmed. Every aspect of the show was a sensory nightmare. The jeers and screams of a couple of hundred bloodthirsty people were bouncing off the walls of a small, dank goth club. It was hot and typically Toronto humid, and we were all soaked in our own sweat, each other's, and whatever was stuck to the disturbingly under-sterilized mats. But all I remember was the satisfaction I felt. For a brief, magically suspect moment in time, the PFL started to take off. Our first shows, held at a dying Toronto goth bar that had Doctor Who fetish gear tucked into its basement for some reason, sold out quickly. We started touring and held successful events in Windsor, Montreal, and New York. International media and an ultimately failed TV deal followed. As I demonstrated an over-enthusiasm for talking, I was trusted with a large portion of the promotional duties. In addition to our shows, I had the opportunity to hone my character on TV, radio, and a segment of VH1's Celebrity Fit Club where I rolled around a La Hollow Taekwondo studio with a pajama-clad Maureen McCormick. Being cerebellum was easy. In many cases, it was more comfortable than being Sarah Kurchak was. I seamlessly slid into her tics and mannerisms for events and interviews. It took nothing to adopt her quips and self-possession and her bountiful character flaws. I told myself this was merely the mark of a good performer, that the reason I felt more at ease being in front of hundreds of bloodthirsty fans or live in a Times Square storefront studio than I did when I was being myself in a casual one-on-one conversation was because I was just such a natural. This was, I slowly came to realize, not entirely the case. I did seem to have some skill in the area, and all of the hours I'd spent obsessively studying VHS tapes of The Rock and Jericho's performers had clearly paid off. But I was vastly overestimating how much of my time in the PFL was a performance, and how much was semi-consciously working through complex issues of identity, self-concept, and self-acceptance by insulting and beating up my friends on television and in crowded bars across Ontario and New York State. When I first became a part of the Chart magazine microcosm, I felt like I was less alone in the universe, and like I'd finally found some piece of my place in it. I got to work on something I really cared about with other like-minded people who felt the same way about the same things, including each other. Joining the PFL was like my Chart experience hopped up on some cocktail of performance-enhancing drugs, hallucinogens, and cat memes. One of my best friends, the artist formerly known as Betty Clocker, officially joined because she was under the impression that the PFL would be something between a fight club and informal group therapy. We'd hit each other with pillows for an hour, cry, and then hug it out. She may have misread the audition call, but she wasn't exactly wrong either. If you're the type of person who signs up for something as unapologetically absurd and niche as professional pillow fighting, there is a strong chance that you'll find at least some sort of kinship with the other ne'er-do-wells who think that's a good idea. With a few dramatic exceptions, I did. Whether we were writers, alt-fashion models, chefs, students, a waitress unbiting her tongue for the first time in 20 years, a drug analyst, that's what she wrote on her application, or some combination of the above, we found some unique and thrilling common ground. These bonds only intensified as we banded together against increasingly bizarre circumstances and erratic management. Glow, Netflix's fictionalized account of the bonkers 80s promotion Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, is an alarmingly inaccurate portrait of how I spent/wasted my mid-20s. The women of the PFL became my found family and my war buddies. We'd yell at each other in character and genuinely try to beat the snot out of each other to the best of our limited abilities in front of crowds and cameras. Backstage, we'd giggle, cry, hug, trade increasingly dirty in-jokes, talk about how much we loved each other, and try to make some sense of whatever the fuck was happening to our lives. Somewhere between this maladjusted but largely loving embrace of my reprobate sisterhood and that strange liminal space between fiction and reality that the PFL borrowed from wrestling, I started to work on some stuff. I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I think this implausible environment finally gave me the breathing room to figure out who and what I could be in a way that the high stakes of normal childhood and adolescent socialization had never allowed. The word reclaim feels so corny to me in a context like this, but being cerebellum did allow me to revisit some of the parts of myself that I'd assumed had to be discarded entirely. Turning them into some muddy hybrid of an entirely separated character and an exaggerated persona meant that I could see if that version of myself had always been as unwanted as I'd assumed without risking too much in other aspects of my life. Playing around with her foibles allowed me to test out a version of myself that I wasn't quite ready to be anywhere else yet. If cerebellum did something that rubbed people the wrong way, I could say that it was the character. If she did something they didn't hate, though, well, that action and reaction could be stored away for Sarah Kurchak's future use. The sort of hiding in plain sight as your true self, or playing a character who is actually playing some part of your life that's been kept secret for whatever reason, can definitely be used in bad faith. I'd be lying if I said that I never gave in to the impulse to write off an actual human mistake as something I'd done on purpose as cerebellum. And I've winced in recognition when I've caught some of my favorite wrestlers pulling similar shit. If you're not using it as a way to shrink accountability, though, this type of public performance provides a unique opportunity for anyone who has, out of necessity, been forced to hide themselves. In quote-unquote character, you can comfortably test the waters and see if it's safe to stop. At some point, Bellum ceased getting so many boos. In part, this was because I was a terrible fighter and, with a few notable exceptions, was routinely humiliated in matches. After a while, booing the shitty little one who kept valiantly getting her ass kicked by bigger and more talented opponents just felt mean. Pity wasn't the only reason for the shift, though. It turned out that Ms. Bellum wasn't entirely loathsome after all. Eventually, she evolved from a pompous heel into an occasionally sympathetic tweener. She had a chip on her shoulder and an overconfidence in her brain that was probably the result of some deep-seated insecurities as a person, but she was trying her best in her own clumsy way. She consistently said the wrong things, but sometimes she was funny. She had an ugly competitive streak, but her fellow pillow fighting misfits as much as, but she loved her fellow pillow fighting misfits as much as she hated losing to them. A bit of a mess and a bit of a dick as a result, but not without her charms. She was, in fact, the person who Aaron had seen all along, and the one the other women of the PFL embraced as one of their own. She was someone I liked being. To give you an idea of just how well my PFL family got me, let me tell you about the first time I ran into our ref, Matt, after my diagnosis. I was amazed when I heard that, Maddie said to me. My heart sank. While most of the people who had known me as a child, especially my old teachers, received the news of my official autism with a complete absence of surprise, people who had met me in adulthood were almost uniformly incredulous. And it hurt to see a big part of myself, one that had seemed at least somewhat obvious to me the whole time, questioned by people who I thought understood me. Once again, I dejectedly assembled all of my talking points in my head. about what I'd been like as a kid, how I'd learned to hide this or that, and how the stereotypes about autism aren't really in line with its reality, and started to run through them. No, he stopped me. I was surprised that you hadn't been diagnosed ages ago. I almost cried in relief as he started listing all of the reasons that he knew. The PFL eventually fell apart, both because of management issues and because it was a professional pillow fighting league, and what else was it going to do, really? But I've held on to the friendships I made and the shit I figured out there. Of all the silly and inconsequential things I've done in my life, this was easily the silliest and most inconsequential, and yet it was the source of something bordering on catharsis. Finally, being diagnosed with autism helped me to figure out some sense out of a lot of aspects of my life. The subsequent years of autism-friendly therapy that I've undergone have allowed me to work on a lot of issues from a more informed perspective. And yet nothing I've actively done to try to make my life as an autistic person better or more bearable has been quite as effective as the 2 years I spent being two people and hammering out the first hints of an actual self in the secret space protected between them. As much as I still grumble about certain parts of the PFL now, and as much as I try to laugh off the growing nostalgia I have for that period of my life, lest I sound like an even more saddled lady clinging to her former glory years than I am, I remain confused but grateful for all of it, and for the women who still call me Bellum. Alright, I believe Erin is coming back for a last cue.
All right, last round of questions,
Right.
and then we'll wrap this up. So I'm going to start with two more taken from the comments section.
Okay.
Again, transcribe or what do
Transcription?
Yeah, I didn't transcribe these ones either. Paraphrased.
Okay.
From Theo, how is writing life during isolation?
Let's see, I did write the guide to getting into DDT in isolation, so I guess I can't say that I've done nothing. And I actually have kept up on all my assignments for my day job, which is working on a blog for a martial arts supply company that I really love. So that's all happening, but there's no King Lear happening in here, if that's the question. There's a lot of crying though, which is part of my process. Maybe that'll lead to something.
All right, and another one from CGJ. Are there F-bombs in the book?
Oh, so many. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a joke.
No, if you don't appreciate bad language or just off-color jokes, then you probably shouldn't read this book. I'm super earnest about some stuff. You will never hear me use ableist language. I stopped even writing the word stupid publicly 3 or 4 years ago. So that level of stuff you will never find. I'm anti-racist, anti any form of discrimination, but anything that's gross that doesn't actually hurt people, I'm all fucking for it.
Okay, so we're hitting the home stretch. Let's extract another personal anecdote out of you. Can you explain to the viewers your current war with socks?
Oh, so socks are usually some sort of canary in the coal mine for me in terms of where I am with autistic sensory issues. So there will be periods where it's a complete princess in the pea situation where I will have to surgically remove weird fuzzy spots from my socks. And yes, you say don't get socks with fuzz in them, but I don't like that texture either. So right now that we're living in a shoeless world, bare feet are just not satisfying to me outside of working out right now, which I love for proprioception. But I like being in socks, but I only like certain kinds of socks, and other socks start to feel like one of my toes cramps. So I've been trying to separate my good socks, and I'm trying to do a lot of laundry because who knows what's happening outside the apartment building, but there's 5 pairs of socks that make me not want to rip my feet off, and I have to try to keep them clean and paced throughout the week and look forward to my friendly socks. All
right, 2 more. This is going to be a tough one. In your book, there's 2 separate, I'm pretty sure, it's blurring a little bit, separate essays related to travel stories of sorts. One to Port Merion, one to Las Vegas.
Yes.
If you were only able to keep one location and the other one was erased from the face of the earth, which one would you keep?
What the fuck? Like, was that you or?
No, I'm not gonna say who came up with that question. Let's reframe it. Which do you prefer, Port Merion or Las Vegas?
They fulfill such different roles for me. Like, don't actually make me choose between these two very important places in my life.
You have to choose one.
Oh, for fuck's sake. I mean, I'm sure McGowan went to Vegas at some point, but he did make a hallucinogenic show there. Oh god, I'm gonna say Port Merion.
Can you tell everybody what Port Merion is?
So it's a remote, like cottage industry village. No one actually lives there. In semi-North Wales. It was, I think, not quite 100 years ago, created by this guy who happened to have some money, but some very money connections, who became convinced that the future of Welsh manors was going to be to create weird tourist villages on the grounds. So he just started carting in all of these random pieces of blown out buildings from the war and building new buildings out of them and painting them all sorts of different colors, and then putting in a bunch of trails and stuff. And then at some point people started filming stuff there, including a show called Danger Man, which is also called Secret Agent Man. If you know the song, yeah, it's from there. Which was starring Patrick McGowan, and McGowan saw this place and was basically like, fuck yeah, I'm gonna make the most surreal spy show nightmare of all time here. And Port Merion became the village from The Prisoner. And if you've ever seen a clip of The Prisoner, you probably have a very clear picture in your mind of this place, which looks almost exactly the same to this day. I've been twice now. It is just the weirdest, most bizarre, but most charming place on earth. And the grounds that surround it are absolutely stunning too. There's all these sort of trails, these cliffs. You can run on the beach like McGowan. You'll probably break your ankle trying, but it's beautiful. There's a pet cemetery. It's really, really charming, but also has this beautiful fucked up history, and I love it so much.
All right, so last question. There's a couple different ways that you think that you can probably answer this. Mm-hmm. I'll answer one way for you, mm-hmm. and before I pose it, and the question is, who do you hope reads this book? And I'll say for our household, everyone, because we want that money. But how about you tell everybody who you actually, when you think about the audience that you want, who you really want to be able to reach with the words that you wrote and all the time that you spent thinking about it?
I mean, everyone, and not just for the money, but because I really want, people not just to read this book and think about autism, but to read it and think wow, I know even less than I thought I knew. This can't be an endpoint for me. I have to seek out all of the autistic voices I can, and absolutely do, because I am one person and I really don't want to be a spokesperson for this. I say it 6,000 times in a disclaimer at the front of the book, but please, just consider me one person in a voice of many, and consider, if this is a start for you, the sort of crack in the dam that makes you think of other perspectives and try to find more voices. And yeah, I really want autistic people to appreciate it. I want non-autistic people to have their minds opened by it. I think it's really funny that people who are professional clinicians and stuff who are reading my book to learn more are gonna learn about S-laying and pillow fighting from this. But if I could only pick one demo, it would be young women, or not just women, of any gender, but anyone who is currently the alone teenager I was, super confused, just if they could find this book and feel slightly less like shit than I did at their age, that's would be incredibly important to me, just on a super earnest level. I just want them to find it and to find value in it.
I mean, that sounds like a good way to end it, unless you want to go into the and always promote where to buy the book, which is on our actually set list.
About this. So books are available through online vendors. You know what those are. I'm not going to name them because I'm sure we all have moral issues with at least some of them, but it's fun to go to. But definitely, if you can, please visit local bookstores. I will post the link to the Google map showing you where you can buy it in Canada.
Someone already did, like, multiple times.
Oh,
it's
good.
Amazing.
Thank you so much, whoever that was, that I probably know that Aaron doesn't. And so, buy it through any of those means. I don't know what's going on with an audiobook. I was asking about that again. But I will try to figure out more of these details later. But for now, check out the Google map. And
right. I'm slinking away so that the last shot is just you staring at the camera.
So I would like to thank everyone for doing this. I really hope it didn't carry on too long, but if it did, I suppose that is on brand too. I hope this is framed in a way that really doesn't show off my double chin, but Aaron is terrible at shooting me and always has. I would like to apologize for Aaron's choices for not letting me wear the tits shirt, which I think would be glorious, but I suppose Miami Vice is appropriate too. I would like to thank Arcadia, who's been here the whole time. She's currently sleeping. Thanks for everyone for sitting through this, and I gotta go now, but thank you. Love you.